Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. We're speaking with Jim Hawkins, former retail ad manager at the Kenosha News. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. When did you start working at the Kenosha News?
Well, I started working at the Kenosha News when I was a senior in high school in May of 1956. And I worked part-time until school was out, until I graduated. And then I worked full-time at the Kenosha News as a proof dispatcher. That's a young man who would take copies of the ads out to the retailers to have them checked over for error or any changes they wanted to make. And then I left and I graduated from high school, and I went in the Navy in September of that year and left the News and spent 3 years on active duty in the United States Navy. And then I left active duty in September of '59 and finished my obligation of 3 years in reserves and held various jobs. I was a clothing salesman. I sold door to door. I driver salesman for a beer distributorship. And ultimately, in January 22nd of 1963, an opening came up in the classified department for an outside salesman, and I applied for that and got that job. So,
what was the hiring process like for you then?
They had been looking for a salesman for a while, and they hadn't come upon anybody. And Bill Schulte had suggested they contact me because I had worked at the paper before. I knew everybody. I was from town, I knew the town, I'd been a proof boy, and he sort of pushed my name along with the classified manager. At that time it was Jim Jones to hire me, and that's basically, beyond that I just applied and went in and went back when they called me. Yeah.
And your first job, you said, was an outside salesman in classified?
Correct. This was a period of time where nationally newspapers, which always had a classified advertising department, limited their advertising to everything in column, which means no pictures, no artwork, just typeset within the boundaries of a column. And so they were expanding at that time across the country and starting to handle automobile advertising and real estate advertising, which needed display ads, what we call display advertising, which used artwork and removed the rules from the ads. But it was in such a way that some companies at this time, even though they put display ads in, they were still running the rules through the ads. And we didn't do that here in the Kenosha News. We went to a straight display advertising kind of format. And I was an additional new salesman, not replacing anyone. There were two other full-time outside salespeople calling on real estate and automobiles at that time doing the same thing.
You say these classified ads originally were run in column. Now,
correct.
How wide is a column?
Well, it's changed over the years. There used to be, the Kenosha News when I started was 8 columns on a page, and the page was wider. Then as time went along, paper became more expensive, and they cut down 2 columns on the size of the paper. As far as the actual measurement right now, I can't remember. I really can't remember.
But then it was also then based on an inch,
an inch high within the column. That was, yes. In classified advertising, advertising was charged by the line of the copy within that ad. The column inch rate was something we used in retail, which I got over there then. That was a different rate structure.
Okay, so what was it like to go to these real estate people and the car dealers to sell advertising to them?
Well, you had an account list that you called on regularly, and any new accounts that you could develop on your own. But basically, you, as we used to tell everybody, and everybody seemed to know, your first job was to go out and make a friend. And so, because you'd be calling on these people on a weekly basis. And it was to go out and help them set up a budget for advertising, of what they were going to spend, how much. In a lot of times you develop a format, a general appearance for the ad, particularly in classified, and then it was just a matter of putting copy in each week and getting the copy. And it was you had to develop relationships, and because you were calling on these people, like I say, on a weekly basis, and sometimes for years and years. We had, in classified, there were a number of accounts that at that time, back in the 60s, had been running in classified for 50 years. There were a lot of long-time loyal advertisers, but basically ran the same ad. So every day.
So you would go to them each week and kind of develop your friendship and learn how his business operated and develop or suggest an ad, or they would.
We get the copy, the information that go in within the ad. We get that each week from them, and then put it in and change it and make suggestions if we thought we had an idea of something. We had a little creativity, but much more so in the retail department than in classified.
And how long did you work as an outside classified salesman?
In classified, actually I was only there for 1.5 years because both of the other salesmen who had been there for a number of years longer left. One went into real estate and one went to work for one of the financial institutions in town. So in June of '64, roughly around that time, I was transferred over to the retail department.
And how was that different?
Retail department dealt with basically, as the name implies, retail advertising or any other business other than people running a classified. We did not handle real estate, and we did not handle automobiles. Everything else pretty much ran through our department.
Every store, whether clothing or shoes
made no
or
difference.
Groceries.
Yeah. And you, again, same thing, develop relationships, set up a budget primarily, work with them on a weekly basis. Being a salesman, you didn't sell something once. You had to resell every week, and every time you went back in, you were selling the same product. So.
And how were you paid as a retail ad salesman?
A retail ad salesman, we were paid on commission. I may be mistaken, but I believe it was 7% of the cost of the ad would go to you as pay for that. There was a minimum you would draw, and that changed over the years and your seniority. The minimum that you would draw, guaranteed draw, but the total was based on pure commission, and you were guaranteed a minimum, but beyond that it was all commission, yeah.
Okay, so you were working as a retail sales rep for how many years, how long?
Well, I was at the news for 42 years, and all but 25 years of that I was an outside salesman. The last 25, while I still sold and had an account list, the last 25 years I was the retail manager.
So when did you retire?
I retired on my 42nd anniversary, January 22nd, 2005. I've been retired at this point for 17 and a half years.
Okay, so describe for me the process of what you needed to do to put the ad together after you had visited an account.
Well, again, it varied from account to account depending on the type of business they were in. And they usually had a pretty definite idea of what they wanted to run in an ad, or had an idea, particularly in the area of fashion or clothing or things of this nature. They wanted a style that was regular, and you would just work off of that variation. But basically we'd get the information, go back to the office, and we would lay out the ad. That is, we'd draw the borders and design the ad, put in artwork, copy, write the copy, and then set it up to be set. And then reviewed with the proof of that before it ran.
And then what was the focus of what you tried to accomplish with those advertisers?
Well, again, it was a matter of developing a relationship, because you had to be dealing something. When you walked through the door, you basically became their employee, and you wanted to work for them for the betterment of their business. The better they did, the better you did by selling them the advertising. You could bring them ideas, concepts, make suggestions on different copy. But in some cases, I had to write the copy from scratch. They'd just give me basic information that I'd have to write the copy to work into with the artwork and the rest of the picture. Some people were very, very particular. Some had a limit. They knew how many words of copy they wanted to use and where it was going to go in relationship to the artwork, and were very, very important. Others were just sort of putting it in our hands to do whatever we felt comfortable with.
And to you, what was the most important thing that these advertisements had to do?
Well, to me, and I still believe it to the day, the thing with newspaper advertising, particularly local advertising, you want people to come to your door. You want to get people to go through their door of the account, to get them in there to buy. And I find that nowadays people have forgotten that. You can't get people to come through your door if you don't tell them where the door is. So the most important thing was make sure you told people where the business was, what the hours were, and any other pertinent information that you would need to get them to come there and do business with the account, yes.
Okay. And was there any competition when you first started as a retail salesman based on, I know there was a newspaper, and then was there any competition for those ads?
At that time, the Kenosha Labor paper was very active. It was a weekly that came out presented by the UAW union. It was basically a tabloid newspaper on a weekly basis. There were other, radio, of course, was very strong, a strong competitor for us and selling advertising. And there were other papers from out of town sometimes would come in the area, but they weren't really competing with us because they had a different customer list of subscribers than we had. So I would say basically radio was the biggest competition. A while after I got into the business, Happenings magazine started up, and that was basically, and still is basically, an entertainment document, which lists entertainment around town with editorial to back that up.
When you say tabloid, you don't mean that kind of that in understanding of what a tabloid is, or you meant by the size that it appeared?
Well, the Kenosha News and most daily newspapers are broadsheet, and they're long and wide. A tabloid is basically turning that on the side, and the center fold of a broadsheet is the spine of a tabloid. It's a definite term that applies to a format. The term tabloid publication has over the years sort of evolved into a type of publication, which tends to be misconstrued sometimes, but tabloid is definitely just the format.
Okay, what kind of changes occurred during your time at the Kenosha News, either technological or the industry itself, or changes to the cost of materials or anything like that?
Well, just about everything you mentioned changed. Basically, when I started in let's say 63, when I was full-time, we were still setting what we call hot metal, and as all the ads and everything were set by hand with type, lead type, and reproduction of art was much more difficult. I had to have an engraving made and use that. And by the time I left, there was no metal left at all. There was no handset type, and we were into offset printing, which is an entirely different process. Actually, we were two processes from where I started. The building changed. As the Kenosha News that I knew, I started at, the press was we could look at the press standing on a sidewalk out front through a big window. And that building evolved, and I went through, I think, probably three remodeling of the building, plus the expansion and buying up until it got to be what is now Herzing University here in town. Just about everything changed over those years. I was just happened to be looking at some old rate cards I had, and in the first 20 years or so that I was at the paper, the rates almost doubled. as everything else in prices kept going up and still going up. The composition, putting the ads together became easier. And quite honestly, the salesman today, as far as I know, does not have as a complete contact with their account as they used to, because sometimes they get the information, instead of doing it themselves, they're passing it along to somebody else who's doing a lot of the ad makeup away from the desk. Not our pots of rubber cement and art gum erasers are long gone. So.
Okay, did the paper moving additions around the creation of a Sunday paper and dropping Saturday or adding Saturday back or going to morning, did that have any effect on the ad sales department?
Not really. It was just doing the same thing for a couple of other publications. Not only did we add the separate TV section at one time, we also added an entertainment section called Get Out, which is separate. And then we also purchased over the years some other outside publications that we took on and into our home, the Bargainer, the Courier. We also printed the Zion Benton News and the Bargainer. So there was always quite a few different publications we had going at any given time.
So that if you did a special interest section, would these sales reps be limited to their accounts to try to put ads in those sections, or was it handled differently?
Well, they would start with everybody had a list of accounts. If you could had someone that was not on somebody else's list that you found or showed an interest, you certainly salesmen would sell them. You're always looking to make your account list grow. But you were limited. When I went into the department, because I was an additional salesman, not replacing someone, my list was made up of accounts that came from all the other salesmen. They all got rid of 5 accounts, I believe, and that was my basic list, and then I had to build it from there.
And so how many other salesmen were there at the time that you got 5 from their lists?
I believe that when I started, there were 5 full-time salespeople at that time. It expanded more later on, but yeah.
So those 5 gave you 5. You had 25 accounts.
Basically,
Okay.
true, yeah.
And how did that grow over time for you before becoming an ad manager?
It's hard to say, because there were some people who only advertised like once a year for some reason. Others are advertised daily. It really depended on the kind of and what happened within the community as far as growth. New businesses coming into town, new businesses starting up, or businesses closing. So there's always your account list was always in a state of flux. You always had to be aware and looking and trying to find new business and making up for businesses you lost.
Was there competition in trying to add a new account that one person may have started contacting and then another person didn't know they were doing it, or was that not a big deal?
Very seldom. Normally it was pretty well known. In some cases, well, we were out every day on the street, and we were when I started at the newspaper, in fact, the majority of the retail businesses were all in we call downtown Kenosha now. Sears was downtown on 6th Avenue. Montgomery Ward was across the street from the news building on 58th Street. And all the rest of the buildings all had retail businesses in them. And they didn't really have any arrangement made for travel. Over the period of time, there was a period of time right after I started where they were getting chips for the trolleys, to take trolleys to businesses. Well, that proved to be very hard to handle. And so ultimately, and when I left, and I believe it's the way now, they were getting mileage for their cars. You drive your own car, and you would get, at that time, 50 cents a mile for business use that you would be reimbursed.
Okay, so when you would first speak to an advertiser, they say, I want to do a full page ad, and that's really what I'm looking at, or I just want to run this one ad. How would you suggest going forward to an account?
Well, first of all, my philosophy, or the philosophy of those at the paper at the time, was it was better to be the repetition, to see the ad on a continuing basis. Well, while you may not always read the ad for content, if you had an identity or a look or a style to your ad, that was an impression every time you went past it or looked at it or turned the page. And it was better to have, because then if an account didn't want what you were selling at the time, when you wanted something they had, then the first thing would come to be the top of mind awareness of seeing that image and that constant repetition. So I had occasions many times where I talked people out of running a full page and into running a series of ads in order to develop that top of mind awareness. And we actually had some sales promotions which we concentrated on that, of selling much smaller ads for a year and variations of that, but to get the repetition so that the top of mind awareness would come back to you. Yeah.
And is that where the rate card comes in? You were showing your account the card, which was pricing, I assume.
Well, again, you have to, you almost have to start with figuring out what they can afford to spend. You never want to put somebody out of business, getting them to advertising to get business. And so you had to work with the account, get to understand what they wanted, what their purposes were, and what they were trying to accomplish with the ad. But the rate cards were established. The charges were by the column inch, as we mentioned a little earlier, 1 column wide, 1 inch deep, and the multiples of that up to a full page size. A full page size at that time was, when I started, was 8 columns by 21.5 inches in depth. And then it slipped down to the 6 column by 21.5 inches would be a full page. And you could buy, the minimum size would have been 3 column inches for a retail department.
Okay. When you worked at the newspaper, were there clubs? Were there sports teams? Were there things going on that the employees could take part in, or work together on, or
so the social aspect
socializing?
Of it.
Yes.
Back at the time when I started the paper, there was a great division between departments. They're all quite different, and historically in the industry, of the newspaper industry, there was sort of a bit of an animosity and competition between editorial and advertising. But as far as there were clubs within the organization. There was the 20-year club. If you get to be 20 years, you got a pin. And in the Kenosha News, the 20-year club had a policy that if you were ever wearing anywhere and you ran across someone else from the Kenosha News in the 20-year club and you didn't have your pin on, they could call you on it and you'd have to give them $1. It was just sort of a running. Well, I had mine made into a ring, so I never was without it. I always had it with me. But then there was also, there were several, there was a Deadline Club, which again was purely a social club. And then in the early 80s or so, we started a softball team and a basketball team and a few other things in sports-wise, just to get people together more and get to know each other. And the softball team, you had to be an employee to be on the softball team. No husbands, no boyfriends, no spouses, all employees, and it got people together and you got to know each other a lot better from different departments, and a lot of problems were solved over a beer after the ball game that we wouldn't have to deal with during the day at work, and it proved to be very successful. By the way, we had a terrible, terrible softball team. First few years, we lost 27 games in a row, and we were so bad that Chet from Chet's Sports Bar put our picture up on the wall with all the winning teams. And when we started to win, took our picture down.
Any other interesting kinds of stories that you can think of or remember from your time at the news?
Well, like any job, if you do something long enough, something creative is always going to come along. I had a gun put to my head by an account trying to threaten me. That didn't work out. I walked out and told him I was the bottom of the barrel and nobody else after me. And we ended up being very good friends and a good account. That was once. Had another account who hired an ad agency to design his ads for him. And the gentleman did it all freehand and developed a new logo, which is their signature at the bottom of the ad normally. And it developed it, and it became quite productive, and it was quite well known. It was a V. The company's name started with a V, and so they had it. The V was the fingers like this. Well, they're out of business now, but Vagansky's sign of value. And everything went through, and by this time we were into offset printing, and everything was it wasn't in lead; it was in paper. And somehow we were having there were some problems within the paper with a few people, and the proof went out, was corrected, and when it came back to the paper it was okayed. But when the ad ran in the paper, one of those fingers was removed from the art, and that was the sign of value at that time. It was not very good for the company or the business or for the salesman, who happened to be me. And so we've had occasions where things have happened, little things of that sort, but can laugh at them now, but they weren't funny then.
Did the company have parties, picnics, anything like that?
When I started the paper, when I started in high school, the paper was owned by R.S. Kingsley. By the time I came back in '63, Howard Brown was the owner. But early on, it was always a June 8th party, which was R.S. Kingsley's birthday, which was a company-wide party, a dinner, a very nice dinner for husbands and wives and all the employees at the Elks Club in the ballroom. And ultimately, over the years, that sort of evolved. After Kingsley sold the paper, it evolved into a very, very nice, quite elegant Christmas party also at the Elks Club. But it was all employees. It was very nice. The company always did a very good job of taking care of us.
Who was your longest account?
You mean longest tenured?
Yes. Not the longest in any other direction,
Well,
but I mean,
okay.
terms of years.
Oh, Lord,
Or just any long-standing account.
Well, again, it's a matter of you try to deal with everybody in town and anybody who's in business in town. I mean, personally, I handled Lathrop Furniture when they were in town here. Vagansky's. I had Hollab's women's wear. Ventura Jewelers. I mean, a lot of different accounts, but for a long period. But again, it's a matter of a lot of different things involved. Some would pass away, the business go out, who knows. But if they were in business in town, we basically dealt with them at one time or another.
How has advertising changed since you left the paper?
Well, electronics, I mean, the internet has taken a lot of things, and their purpose is, as I alluded to earlier, their purpose is a little bit different. Instead of trying to get people to come to the door of the business, the electronic advertising seems to be directing everybody to call them on the cell phone and call their phone instead of going to the business and through the door. The cardinal sin when I started in a newspaper, the biggest sin in the world was to not have an address or location for a business. Nowadays, you can't find the address anywhere, and I'm looking for the address because I'm an old man. Yeah.
So what do you think the future is of advertising in newspapers or newspapers in general?
Well, personally, I love the newspaper business, and I love newspapers, and I find great value in them. But I'm afraid that everybody's getting to the point of wanting such immediate satisfaction and immediate return on things that they don't want to take the time to sit down and read a newspaper. And I'm afraid, I'm scared to death about the loss of newspapers, but their impact is becoming less all the time. both editorially and advertising lines.
What was the best part of your job?
Going to work every day. I love my job. It was fun. It was exciting. There was enough creativity in it to be a challenge continually. Dealing with people for both the good and the bad. It was not always a pleasurable trip, but it was always interesting. And the challenge was delightful. The rewards were quite sufficient. I was able to make a very nice living and career out of the newspaper business. But the greatest joy in the world was just going to work every day, and the people I worked with, and the people that we all worked together.
Do you miss it?
Yes, definitely.
And because of what you earlier just described?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jim. Thanks for talking to us today.
Well, thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.